You're watching Station Zero.
I've hesitated to share this story for a long time, because I know how important the mutual trust between a resident and their landlord/maintenance staff is, and I don't want to instill any unnecessary distrust in anyone's landlord. I've shared stories before about dangerous and scary residents I encountered while working at apartment complexes, but this is a story about my time on the other side of things, as a renter. Before I'd even graduated from high school, I knew I wanted to live at Paradise Apartments. I was a bit naive at the time, drawn in by the many amenities I would never use, but I primarily wanted to live there because the complex was pet-friendly and within my small budget. When the time eventually came for me to get my own place, I sublet the only apartment they had available and moved in. Fortunately, I came to realize the apartment wasn't as nice as I had originally thought. The building was old but remodeled, so it had all the typical plumbing issues and thin walls. I also learned it was not the safest part of town. I was primarily an online student, but I had one class that met in person twice a week around 8 AM. I'm a bit of a homebody, so I rarely left during the day, except for that class, the occasional shopping excursion, or to spend time with my boyfriend in the evening after he got off work. My apartment was a bit of a Bermuda Triangle. Even though it was only 600 square feet and I lived alone, things had a way of growing legs and walking away. I had 2 kittens at the time and blamed them regularly for things disappearing. Something odd that kept reoccurring, however, was that I'd find my underwear box out and sitting in the center of my bedroom floor on days when I had class. I didn't have a proper dresser, instead using an IKEA shelf with some IKEA boxes for designated clothes, socks, underwear, pants, and pajamas. I always could have sworn I'd put the underwear box away after getting ready for class, but I chalked it up to me forgetting as a result of having to get up early and being focused on getting to class on time. Arguably paranoid, I started to think that some of my laundry was disappearing as well, as favourite articles of clothing would go into the laundry hamper and seemingly never come back with the clean clothes. Towards the end of that semester, I was working one evening on a homework assignment when my boyfriend called me to let me know his roommate had accidentally locked him out of their apartment. I had a key to their place, so he asked if I could run over real quick and let him in. Before I left, I made a mental note that I'd left literally every light in my apartment on, because I was living on a pretty tight budget. I normally made a point of turning off all the lights when I left, but my boyfriend only lived about 5 minutes away, so I knew I'd be there and back very quickly. Sure enough, I got back less than 15 minutes later. I immediately sensed that something was off, as I could see the lights were off through the blinds. I called my boyfriend and he drove over to meet me. We unlocked the door and went in. All the lights were off in my apartment. Thinking maybe I'd had a power outage, I flipped on the main light and it came on. My boyfriend checked the entire apartment. No one was inside, but someone had gone through and systematically turned off every light at their switch, including my lizard's basking light, the only light I always left on because it was on a timer, and my laptop, which I left open on my assignment, but now the computer had been powered down and closed. We called the emergency maintenance number and I explained that someone had been inside my apartment and that they have used a key because there was no sign of forced entry. The manager called me back and told me I'd been imagining things. Maybe I'd forgotten that I turned off the lights before I left. I assured him I wouldn't have turned off the computer or the lizard light. Someone had been in my apartment. I told him I was extremely worried because obviously this person had a key to get in. Either they worked for the complex or maybe it was a previous tenant/guest. I asked if they had changed the locks after the previous tenant moved out, and they assured me they changed the locks after every move out. The manager suggested maybe it was a friend pranking me, someone else I had given a key. The only other people I had given keys were my boyfriend. His key to my apartment had been locked inside his apartment on the same key ring as his own apartment key, and my mom, she lived 3 hours away. In any case, neither of them would have pranked me in this way. The manager finally agreed to send someone out immediately to change the lock for my peace of mind. I brought up my concern that it was someone on the staff, since they would be the only other people with keys. The manager claimed the keys were locked in a special safe that required a personalized code in an office with a security camera. They changed my locks, but I had my doubts that it would do much good. As far as I was aware, there were only 2 maintenance men that worked at the complex, One nice older man that didn't seem at all skilled, and a younger guy with a scruffy beard that gave me a bad feeling. I suspected he had to be the one that had come in. When I first moved in, the manager had told me I would be getting a new kitchen counter within the first 3 days. I waited to move in my kitchen stuff, but after a week they hadn't come, and then after a few months I had completely forgotten about it. One day I was sitting in my living room and the scruffy maintenance guy walked in without knocking or announcing himself, and I hadn't received a notice to expect him. He said he was there to replace my countertop. It took him 2 days to install one small piece of counter. A few weeks later, I was getting out of the shower and heard a single knock at the door. I called out, "Just 1 minute!" and hurried to get some clothes. Not 2 seconds later, the door started to open and I had to slam it shut, still wrapped in a towel, to stop him from coming in. He claimed he hadn't heard me call out, but I had my doubts. I don't remember what made-up excuse he had for coming in. Another time I found a note from him that he had come in. Again, it didn't give a reason as to why, but that he'd made sure not to let my cats out. He also made a note about my third cat being cute, except I didn't have a third cat. I did, however, have a picture of my childhood cat in my bedroom on the IKEA shelf where I kept my clothes. At that point, I went to the office to ask them to make a note in my file that I A. wanted at least 24 hours notice before entry going forward, and B. wanted to always be present for future entry. Now that I knew without a shadow of a doubt that someone was coming in secretly, it all made sense. It hadn't been long after the surprise maintenance visit stopped that things had started moving around in my apartment. He was also on site all the time. Everyone on staff also lived at Paradise, so he would know when I came and went. Who knew how many times he had snuck in, how many small souvenirs he had stolen. He could have been coming in while I was asleep. After that night with the lights, I put my own lock on the door, but still didn't totally trust the apartment. I ended up buying a condo shortly after, with help from my parents, subleased the apartment and moved. Right around that time, I also got my first job working at a different apartment complex. In the final days before I left, my mom came into town to help me move my stuff. While she was home alone, I was at class. She caught the scruffy maintenance man trying to get his key to work in my lock. She demanded to know what he was doing, and he said he was there to paint the front door. I hadn't received a notice, and he didn't have any paint or supplies. She told him he could wait until after I had moved out. A few years later, I was shopped by the owner of Paradise Apartments while working at another complex in town. Okay, apartments. Shopping is when an employee from one apartment complex takes a tour at another apartment complex under the guise of wanting an apartment for the purpose of gaining information they might not otherwise easily give up. It could also be performed by your own management company to make sure you're doing a good job. There were certain tells a shopper always gave, like asking specifically worded questions. Is it safe here? I'm a felon, can I live here? Etc. That required specifically worded answers, and were easy to trip up on. Being too wealthy for the complex, Rolex watch, sports car, nice suit, etc., and being too flexible on what they were interested in, i.e., they were interested in all the layouts and were open to move in whenever. This guy seemed too old and too well off to be randomly considering an apartment at OK. We were geared towards lower income folks, while I was giving out the tour. He asked if I had any opinions on other apartment complexes in town, and mentioned Paradise specifically. Normally I wouldn't badmouth any other complexes. I preferred to win them over by showing them the positives of our community. But I told him that I probably wasn't the best person to answer that question, because I was probably the only person to give Paradise a bad review in the last 5 years. He asked me to elaborate, and I told him my apartment had been broken into, and I suspected it was someone on their maintenance staff. At that point, he revealed that he was the owner of Paradise, and that he was very disturbed to hear I had this experience. He asked me to describe the maintenance man in detail. I assured him it was in the past and I was over it, but he insisted on calling the manager over at Paradise, still the same guy, to ask him over speakerphone if he had any issues with the maintenance staff back in the year I had lived there. He answered yes. There had been a scruffy young maintenance man that he'd had to fire because he'd been caught multiple times breaking into the apartments of single women. Satisfied, the owner proudly told me that the issue had been resolved and asked if I'd be willing to change my review. I told him no, none of this had changed the fact I'd experienced this, and actually validated what I'd suspected. In the years I worked as a leasing agent, I learned a lot about where complexes will cut corners to save time and money. From my experience, a lot of complexes did not switch out the locks if the tenant was good, and a lot did not require background checks for employees, even though they did require them for tenants. Keys also got passed around willy-nilly to vendors and maintenance during turns, and employees frequently got master keys that would open all doors. I won't go as far as to say every single complex operates this way, but every complex I worked at was doing this when I started there. Because of my own experiences, once I began managing complexes, I enforced strict rules about changing locks, tracking keys, posting proper notices, and requiring background checks for all employees and tenants. At least here in Florida, with Maya's law going into effect this year, background checks for employees and security measures for keys are required for all complexes. Even still, if you're renting an apartment, stay vigilant. If you have reason to believe someone is coming into your home, document it, let the staff, police, family, and friends know. You never know who might have a key to your apartment. Several years ago, I was in the midst of an acrimonious divorce from my then husband, full of crazy allegations and typical angry filings centered around custody of our child. As with many divorces, friends and professional colleagues seemed to pick one side or the other. In my case, there was one sort of professional contact who reached out to me after hearing about the divorce, who offered to be a witness for my case because of some experiences he related that I had been previously unaware of regarding my ex's behavior out at networking events. After this initial call, he started calling on a semi-regular basis to make sure I was okay. This wasn't someone I knew well prior to the separation. He was much older than I was, but claimed to have experience with divorce and custody, and I figured it was a good idea to be polite and not alienate him, since his testimony was important, per my lawyer. I kept things friendly, but I always had a weird feeling about him. After a few months, he called one day that my son was very sick. When I told him I couldn't talk and explained why, he offered to run to the store for me, which I honestly appreciated. But after that, he was dropping by the house uninvited, or he would stop by with cookies for my son, etc. Again, I kept telling myself to keep things polite. The divorce is coming soon. Don't make this guy mad. He had called me out of the blue, and I was worried at this point that I was walking a fine line between being polite but clearly not interested, and that if he got mad, he might decide to go testify for my ex and say who knows what. During this time, he had also helped me set up a security cam system my dad had mailed me, and at one point I needed someone to walk my dog, and he had offered to do it. He used and returned a spare key the same day. One evening, he showed up while I was painting and insisted on sticking around to help, even though I was having my starting over catharsis and wanted to do it alone. Just after the painting day, he came around, uninvited and unannounced, with magazine photos of decor, and started carrying on in this manic way about how we could finish decorating the house. I was so weirded out that I made an excuse to leave, started ignoring his calls, and took my son and dog to stay with my parents for several weeks to avoid a drop-in. I came home a few weeks later, thinking he would have gotten the hint, and it was a quiet day. The following morning, I took my son to an outing, and we both came back hot and tired. I put my kiddo down for a nap in my bed, and decided to close my eyes with him. I woke up maybe an hour or so later, and it took me a moment to realize something was way off. As I'm blinking off the sleep, I realized there was a rose bush sitting on the bedside table, that I most definitely had not put there. There was a post-it note on it, something about planting it in the yard. I started shaking immediately, because I recognized the handwriting, and stood up to go splash some water in my face and decided whether to call my parents or the police. As I stepped into my bathroom, I realized that the mirror was covered in post-it notes, all with super creepy messages that were intended as like love notes or with affection, but which all scared me. I was still waking up and trying to figure out how these notes could possibly have gotten into my house. But as I went from room to room, there were notes everywhere. I mean hundreds of post-it notes covering the walls. In my cabinets, there was even one inside my coffee maker. I started grabbing all of them and putting them into a pile, when I got one in the kitchen that made my blood run cold. It said, "You're cute when you think no one is watching you." And I realized there was a security camera pointing right where the note was left, the one he had helped me set up months earlier when I didn't think he was a psychopath. I called my parents in hysterics, sent them a bunch of photos, and my dad insisted I should not call the police, but that he would drive over and change the locks and put a chain on the door. We also immediately changed the passwords on the security cameras, which had been installed to document if my ex tried to break into the house. So there was one on the front porch, but 3 inside the house, including one in my bedroom. This man could apparently see and hear everything going on inside my house for months. The security cameras, I realized he had just paid attention to my passwords when I was setting up the system. But the only way I can figure out that he got into my house is that he must have made a copy of my house key the day that he had it. And because my dog had gotten to know him, he wouldn't have barked to warn me, which also scared me. I was absolutely horrified. This man had been in my house for a long time. There's no way he could have put that many notes up so quickly, and he was right next to my face and feet from my son while we were sleeping, and somehow thought that was okay. I left and stayed with my parents again for a few days, afraid of what he was going to do when he realized that he was now both physically and digitally locked out of my house. When I came home, my son had gone to his dad's for the night, and I was home alone, on the phone with another friend from out of town. At about 10 p.m, this man shows up at my door, pounding on it, trying the locks and screaming obscenities and demanding to be let into his house. Gone were all the niceties. This was someone completely furious and derailed. All I could do was hide in my bedroom until he left. What felt like an hour later, this was St. Patrick's Day, so I'm sure he had been drinking. After that, there were several other times someone would start knocking on the door in the middle of the night, always when my son wasn't home. He tried reaching out using fake social media accounts several times, always getting blocked. Years later, I discovered that he had friended my mom on Facebook and was therefore still able to see all the photos of us that she had posted or shared. And there was a huge argument when I saw a conversation they were having about me and how he could get back into my life. I sold that house 2 years later, still finding new notes even as I was packing, and I am more than relieved that he no longer knows where I live. I don't post photos of my house online, and I have changed the privacy settings on my social media accounts. I avoid all the places he used to go, the networking events he attends, and I stay as under the radar as possible. I could never bring myself to play back the security camera videos because I was traumatized enough and didn't want to see just how much danger we could have been in. Hopefully he never sees this post, but you know who you are. I hope our paths don't cross again. That night, I was hanging out with 3 friends, Sarah, Nick, and Mary. We were celebrating Nick's birthday at his place, which happened to have a hot tub in the backyard. After a couple of hours and a couple too many beers, we jokingly suggested skinny dipping in the hot tub as some kind of birthday present. It would have probably stopped there if it wasn't for our drunkenness, so we did eventually say, fuck it, let's do it. Now for context, Nick's house was by a forest and was very isolated from neighbours. Adding to that, it was maybe past midnight, and anything past the Christmas lights of dubious quality that were spread around the yard was basically pitch black. Being fucking pussies going out there without Nick's parents home would have been unimaginable if it hadn't been for the wonders of inebriation. So semi-reluctantly, I followed my friends into the night with the towel on my shoulder. We reached the hot tub that was worryingly close to the edge of the woods, and we started stripping. Everything was fine for the next 30 minutes or so, apart from the occasional branch cracking. We were having fun, telling stories or rambling about stupid shit, and the fear quickly faded. That was until a deafening shriek came from the darkness of the forest, lasting for about 5 seconds. It sounded like a human voice, but it almost didn't sound like a person. We all turned livid, became silent for what seemed like hours, and I even saw Nick lose his boner in a matter of seconds. We didn't dare try to look into the forest, except Mary, who just grew a pair of balls out of nowhere and picked up her phone to use the flashlight. We couldn't help but follow the light as she pointed it at the forest, who seemed unaffected by it as if the darkness was swallowing it. Nothing. As we were about to stop looking though, the void stared back at us. Mary shined her light far behind Sarah, and it reflected on a pair of eyes and a white form in the distance. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. We rushed out of the tub without even giving a single thought about gathering our clothes. Mary and I screamed. Apparently her balls had been blown to smithereens, and we all ran towards the back entrance as fast as possible. Nick immediately got a knife while we locked every door and window. We wanted to call Nick's parents, or the police, or anyone, but our phones were over by the forest where we left them. Seeing no other choice, Nick put shoes on and made a run for it. He'd managed to get his phone, but he'd heard loud breathing coming from the forest, meaning whatever it was hadn't left. What followed were the shittiest 2 hours of my life. Nick got his parents to make their way home. He handed us towels so we could finally cover ourselves, and we gathered in the basement where there were no windows. We spent most of our time in silence, waiting for something to happen. Half an hour in, we heard another shriek, more distant. Only this time, it was shortly followed by knocks on the door that couldn't possibly be Nick's parents. Sarah actually started crying, but thankfully it stopped after that. The parents arrived and allowed us to sleep in the basement for safety. They hadn't heard or seen anything, and were pretty sure we just imagined stuff. We hardly slept, and once the morning came, we went out to get our stuff. The phones, keys, wallets were all there. The only thing missing were Nick's shirt and Sarah and Mary's panties. So that left us with two possible scenarios. A weird pale-ass pervert spied on us in an isolated area deep in the woods, or whatever other creepy shit roams in there just decided to spook us.
If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And turn on the bell to be up to date on our latest uploads. And remember, don't change the channel.